We will remake the world into our domain, a land of cinder, ash, and the blackened bones of our enemies, until only we remain, and those broken bodies that cower at our feet.
The words of Lord Astrogoth Ironhand. Malign, dark-souled, and merciless, the Uzukul Darash ZHARR, or Darwe ZHARR, or the Chaos Dwarfs, as they are known in legend to the other peoples of the world, are a warrior race of demon-smiths and craftsmen, slavers and brutal killers that dominate the northern reaches of the Darklands, and have done so for thousands of years. Their history is an ancient and terrible history, a saga of great and hardy people whose nobility would become warped into utter malice, and whose stubborn refusal to die would lead them down a dark and bitter path to damnation. The story of the Chaos Dwarfs begins many thousands of years ago, during the great expansion of the dwarf race northwards, long before the rise of man. The dwarfs, cleaving into those lands where metal and gems can be found, and firm rock can be delved, principally followed the track of what is now known as the World's Edge Mountains. Here, they excavated and expanded an underground realm of mighty subterranean fortress cities, linked by countless miles of mine workings and passageways. Eventually, this slow but steady expansion led one group of dwarfs to the uplands in the far north of the World's Edge Mountains range, which they came to know as Zorn Uzkul, or the Great Skull Land. It was a vast and inhospitable plateau where the air was frigid and thin, and the dusty ground littered with the wind-scoured bones of the ancient dead. The mineral wealth was rich here, but the earth and stone to some seemed tainted and unclean. Many dwarfs called the place accursed or turned aside from it, either retreating to the most established holds, or, of more adventurous character, choosing to strike out to far Norska to undertake the journey first east and then south to the rich lodes recently discovered in the Mountains of Morn. Some, however, refusing to be balked, chose to remain in the Great Skull Land, come what may. At first, these distant dwarf kindreds retained close ties of kinship and trade, but as the world darkened and foul things crawled from its depths to sunder the dwarf realm, contact between the far-flung dwarf holds became erratic and infrequent, as each looked to their own survival and defense. When the great time of chaos descended to sunder the world, these most forlorn of dwarf kingdoms were lost to their kinfolk in the World's Edge Mountains, and were given up for dead as a tide of horror spilled across the land. The dwarfs of the West could not have been more mistaken, for the ravages of chaos did not destroy the hardy, determined dwarfs of Zorn Uzkul, but instead worked a dreadful change upon them. It is impossible to say with any certainty exactly when the dwarves of the East became the malevolent entities now known as the Chaos Dwarfs, as the changes wrought into their bodies and spirits were slow and inexorable. Not even they themselves knew the full saga of the dark times of their origins, save for that they were almost utterly destroyed, and it was only by their stubborn refusal to surrender in the face of unspeakable horror and death that they endured. Endured, and came to know a new patron god, Hashut, the father of darkness. Slowly they began to increase again in number, and restore themselves in power and dark majesty, now barely recognizable from what they had been before. Since this new god, Hashut, saved them in the face of unspeakable horror and death. The dwarf race is unusually resilient to the warping influence of chaos, a reflection of natural dwarf stubbornness, perhaps. Nonetheless, the dwarfs who live in the shadow of the Mountains of Morn have changed slowly but inexorably over time, and become twisted in both body and mind. Though they superficially resemble other dwarfs, in all important respects, they are easily distinguished. Chaos Dwarfs, for example, often possess protruding tusks that lend them a brutal, savage expression, and they are commonly grey-fleshed and red of eye. Many have small horns that jut from their forehead, and some even have cloven hooves and worse. Although such extreme mutations are rare amongst ordinary Chaos Dwarfs, and common only amongst sorcerers and those who have the most direct contact with the stuff of chaos. If the influence of chaos has worked terrifying changes upon the bodies of the Chaos Dwarfs, this is nothing compared to the transmutation of their hardy dwarf minds. The traditional dwarf values of stubborn determination, craftsmanship and industry have been twisted into a perverted mockery in the hearts of the Chaos Dwarfs. They became pitiless, macabre, and cold-hearted creatures, devoid of mercy and consumed by a need to enslave and dominate everyone and everything they came into contact with. And from this new need grew their empire. Year upon year, decade upon decade, and then century upon century, with malevolent intent and monstrous patience, the dominion of the Chaos Dwarfs slowly grew. Down the centuries, their culture became as corrupted as their minds at every level, from their language and runecraft to the structure of their clans and their worship, all tainted by chaos and poisoned by malice. But they are still uniquely dwarfen in many aspects. Oath and loyalty, grudge and kingship stand as solid as iron, but mercy and weakness are intolerable flaws to be contemptuously destroyed. Not for them the howling anarchy, slaughter and ravening madness of Chaos's human followers, the unthinking savagery of the beastmen, or even the desperate, labyrinthine intrigues and vicious aggression of the Skaven. Instead, they are consumed with grim, cold cruelty and calculated brutality. The Chaos Dwarfs are irredeemably evil, bitter and self-centered creatures, caring nothing for the life of others, and directing all of their labours into the construction of their great city, ZHARR, the Tower of Fire and Desolation, and the slow expansion of their power and influence in the world. To this end, the Chaos Dwarf armies scour the Darklands and the deadly realms beyond for slaves to fill their city and labour deep beneath the pits that surround it, and to provide sacrifices for the furnace fires dedicated to their dark god, Hashut. Their empire has come to encompass the fire-scorched, volcanic plain of Zarduk, at the heart of which NAGGRUND sits, and like a black iceberg, its true extent lies not above with its armoured ziggurats and fire-lanced temples, but below the surface, in countless miles of magma-lit delvings, cavernous chambers and vaulted mines which resound to the cries of tortured slaves and the ringing of hammers in an untold number of diabolic forges. For many miles around it, the plain of Zarduk has succumbed to the hand of the Chaos Dwarfs. It is littered with the scars of vast open mines, fiery rivers of magma, ash dunes and stagnant pools of foaming yellow and blood red, noxious with toxic spoil and fortified workings, black watch posts which line the great machine-crushed roads, upon which countless slaves haul ore and plunder to feed the ever-hungry city of the Chaos Dwarfs. Beyond their heartland, in the plain of Zarduk, they have risen great fortress citadels and towers to establish their dominion throughout the far-flung and perilous Darklands. Although no force, even one as brutal as the Chaos Dwarfs, can lay claim to the true sovereignty over this vast realm of accursed, monster-filled, shifting ash deserts. At the edges of the Darklands, the outposts and black iron watchtowers of the Chaos Dwarfs extend as far as the great desolation of Asgore, and the coastline of the Sea of Dread to the south, and the High Pass to the north, while Uzkulak, the place of the skull, seat of the ancient dwarf hold before the time of chaos, is still populated, but is a strange, secretive place, and the bustling workings of its slave port and anchorage hide an ancient inner city that is little more than a heavily garrisoned tomb. The forbidden lower levels of Uzkulak are shunned, even by its masters, and to be consigned to its depths is a punishment reserved for oathbreakers and blasphemers, as the worst fate the Chaos Dwarfs can bestow. A fact which, given the malevolent inventiveness of the demon-smiths in such matters, speaks much of the horrors which abide there. The plans of the Chaos Dwarfs are a result of the intricate workings of their malign intelligence, deep paranoia, and cold cruelty. They see no need to ravage the world in a fury, in a desperate bid to crush all before them, only to fall overextended and spent, as so many throngs of human marauders and hosts of green-skinned savages have done in the past. Instead, they hoard their wealth slowly, building huge defences and sustaining a huge economy based off mineral wealth that they mine from the Darklands. They venture forth foremost to harvest slaves to boost their economy, and also punish those that oppose them directly, as is the dwarven custom of grudges, sundering any creature or force that might wax powerful in the Darklands before it can become a threat. More rarely do they travel further afield, mounting expeditions into vast lands in search of strange plunder, whose worth they have seen in the fires of Hashut's altars, avenging some slight, or merely for callously testing their weapons against the powers of the world. As a result of this policy, to many the Chaos Dwarfs are at best a dark legend, until, that is, they have the misfortune to encounter the dreadful truth for themselves. Now I read that the Chaos Dwarfs had a slow but steady increase to their population since they mutated into the tusked creatures that they are today, which prompt me to think about how dwarfs actually reproduce in the Warhammer world, because I know that orcs reproduce in the same way fungus does, so I was thinking perhaps there's some other strange way that the dwarfs reproduce in this world, because obviously you don't see many female dwarfs. But it turns out there are indeed female dwarfs and they reproduce in the normal way, but the female dwarfs are much fewer than male dwarfs. There's a higher chance of them being born male, and additionally, only the best male dwarfs end up getting to actually marry one and reproduce, which is quite interesting because it means, I believe Spartans did this, only the kind of best, most courageous warriors can reproduce and pass on their genes, which I suppose over a big period of time that's going to make the race a lot stronger and braver. It's another reason why all the dwarfs are so brave, I suppose, is that they're trying to eventually be able to get some pussy one day. So they're all kind of machismoed up all the time. So as a result of this, the female dwarfs are even more precious than they are in human society. Because in human society, the reason why males are the ones that are expendable and why we have evolved to be the kind of stronger, more aggressive ones that go out and fight and risk our lives and stuff like that is because wombs can only be occupied by a certain amount of babies. Like, you know, well, sometimes it's twins or whatever, but you can only be pregnant once at a time. So it doesn't matter so much if some of the males die hunting or something, because then we can just have more than one wife, lol. You know, I mean, you gotta do what you gotta do for the tribe, right? But if loads of the females died, then your amount of reproduction has cut down, because you can't get as much kids in the next generation, so there's more of a probability of your tribe, or, you know, whatever group we're talking about, there's more of a probability of them going extinct. So, I mean, imagine that whole situation playing out, but in dwarf society, where there's, like, I'm not sure what the numbers are, but let's just imagine that there's one female for every 10 male dwarves. Yeah, they basically keep them locked up in the dwarven holds all the time, just making food. So, I mean, but that kind of makes sense, and perhaps this is what has given rise to the dwarfs having this kind of fortified mindset and culture, because they have to keep the female dwarf safe. Like, if you imagine, while the dwarfs are away, if the dwarven race didn't have these huge fortresses, imagine if most of the male dwarfs are away fighting or something, and some dragon comes into their fortress and kills all the female dwarfs. I mean, that's the reproduction of this whole Karak destroyed, and they're going to have to import some female dwarfs, or they're going to die out. Once again, the writing of this lore is just incredible. Like, even just that one factor, you could take that back to, like, dwarven prehistory, and then kind of extrapolate it back to the present, and it just makes so much sense how their society has developed. You know, like, so much about what dwarfs are could come from that one fact about how their biology is. And this is the same in a lot of races. Like, greenskins are such a good example of that. I need to do a video about greenskins at some point if people don't really realise what their biology is, because it doesn't change how you see them on the surface. Well, it will, because it explains why they are how they are on the surface. So that's another kind of one to look into. But anyway, onwards. I'm glad I recorded this now, because I didn't have this part in the in the previous one. I'm glad I re-recorded it. I suppose this could also explain the kind of sense of duty that the dwarves have, because when you know that you're probably not going to have kids and have a family of your own, I suppose this can kind of lend itself to a wider way of thinking about your Karak as a whole, instead of just looking out for yourself and your own future family. Do you know what I mean? So perhaps that's another thing that you can get from this. And also the trend to being, like, risk adverse that the dwarfs have, like how they keep all their inventions as a prototype for hundreds of years, because they don't want to. They want everything to work perfectly before they fully embrace it. Perhaps that's another one. But, you know, I'm just spitballing here. I'm going to get back to the Chaos Dwarfs specifically. Although they are dwarfen, you can tell they still are the same species as the other guys. They're just evil and mutated. So yes, like I was saying, the Chaos Dwarfs have enjoyed a slow but steady increase to their numbers since they mutated into the tusked abominations that they are now. But this is still not enough numbers to be carrying out all the manual labour that's required in their empire, and of course they wouldn't have had the growth of empire that they have had so far with regards to their economy and stuff like that if they hadn't taken in slaves to bolster this manual labour. Without slaves, ZHARR NAGGRUND would not have been built, and its vast industries could not be maintained, and even now the need for fresh blood and labour only increases with each passing year, and the desolate empire always hungers for more. So it's because of this, and the fact that these slaves are often dying from the exposure of the poisonous fumes and generally disgusting conditions that they work under down in these pits that the Chaos Dwarfs are working in. They're always dying from this exposure, and so this is what prompts these slaving parties to always come out and collect more of them. It's kind of a perpetual process that's always going to be going on. And they take all comers, really. Like, there's these horse-raiding tribes of the Northern Highlands that they go out and get. There's, of course, lots of orcs and goblins, hobgoblins, chaos beasts from the Northern Wastes, harnessed up for their immense strength and tolerance for injury. We have mutilated elves, flayed and bled to provide alchemical urgence. And, of course, humans, although they're quite good because they are adapted and quick-witted, apparently, but not very durable compared to a greenskin, of course, and more likely to die from fumes. And Skaven as well, although, as we know, if you've listened to my lore videos about Skaven, they can't trust them at all. I mean, like, obviously, if we're having huge numbers of slaves that make your kind of actual civilian population a minority, you're not going to want to have all these slaves as Skaven, because even though they're not as strong as a lot of other races, they're never going to be tamed. They will always try to betray you. So, and the Chaos Dwarfs aren't stupid, they know this. So they're never taken alive unless they are going to be worked almost immediately to death, or used as paltry mass sacrifices to Hashut. And the Chaos Dwarfs have learned from bitter experience that they can have untold spies, saboteurs, and even deliberately infected plague carriers to fucking Allahu Akbar your whole city. Out of all the races that fall into the hands of the masters of ZHARR NAGGRUND, the darkest fate awaits their kin, the dwarfs of the West. The fruits of the bitter malice of long brooding millennia are reserved for the Dawi, and of all the sacrifices to Hashut, none are more favoured than those loyal to the treacherous ancestor gods of the Western Dawi. But anyway, leaving this trans-dwarven hatred aside, this phenomenon of having well, it's not exactly a phenomenon, at least in our history, but I can't think of any other states. Well, Skaven actually have this huge majority of slaves in their population. But yes, this whole situation of having huge amounts of slaves with a tiny civilian population obviously introduces a problem of slave rebellion. Additionally, Chaos Dwarfs have realised the best slaves for most jobs in general are greenskins, because they're very hardy, they don't really tire out much, you don't have to feed them much, and they are very strong. So, yeah, and they don't really use slaves for anything that requires much intelligence to deal with anyway. So, greenskins, boom, they're your best bet for most things. But greenskins are quite hard to control, because they're too kind of stupid and aggressive to really threaten into any kind of obedience. I mean, keeping greenskins under control is like trying to keep under control a whole massive group of jacked up, Down syndrome bodybuilders that are constantly roid raging. And if you've never worked in the caregiving industry, a couple of my mates have, and it's pretty hard, alright? So anyway, they kept suffering these kind of small-time rebellions of just orcs playing out and having little savage kind of autism meltdowns where they just randomly attacked suicidally at these heavily armoured and armed Chaos Dwarf guards. So that was getting quite annoying, a bit of a problem, meant that they had to be guarded all the time, and yeah, so to try and deal with this problem, they created the Black Orcs in an effort to make a kind of slave class to rule over the other slaves. Black Orcs, They created them with blood magic and infernal power. Probably a lot of sacrifices, I would assume. Perhaps sacrificing a lot of orcs. Or, I'm not sure. Perhaps a race that they wanted the orcs to take more of the traits of, so perhaps humans or something. Some other smarter species. The Black Orcs are... The biggest difference is that they're more intelligent, and also they're a bit stronger and larger. And can understand orders a bit more rational. And this worked at first, but the Chaos Dwarfs soon came to realise that their new orc breed was also too independent-minded because it's more intelligent. They didn't realise that with intelligence comes the means to realise that you're being fucked over, and you're being put into a position that you could break out from. So the Black Orcs are realising that there is enough slaves to take over the civilian population. There is enough force there, if it's mobilised, to stage a revolt. And so they ended up turning these kind of small-time instances of greenskins just kind of savagely attacking the guards and getting shut down. They turned these small-time incidents into huge slave revolts by introducing these perfect leaders for the slaves to stage revolts. And a few of these broke out that were crushed quite quickly, and some of the Chaos Dwarfs just thought this was kind of growing pains, and soon they would assimilate and get used to the whole system. But before the Chaos Dwarfs realised their catastrophic mistake at introducing these Black Orcs, there was a huge slave revolt, where the slaves actually managed to get a hold of Chaos Dwarf weaponry, and it became a civil war, really, inside the actual capital of the Chaos Dwarf civilization, ZHARR. As they were obviously incredibly heavily outnumbered, the Chaos Dwarfs had retreated into the actual temple of Hashut itself, and I can imagine that inside, the demon sorcerers were actually kind of frantically sacrificing more and more slaves to try and get an extra bit of favour from the god Hashut, while the whole battle was going on, and they were pinned down, shooting crossbows and stuff out of the windows. But at the last moment, as this whole civilization hovered on the precipice of destruction, the treachery of hobgoblins against their kin actually saved the Chaos Dwarfs. The hobgoblins attacked the Greenskin army from the rear, which sent it into disarray, and eventually it split up, and they started to run away. Many of the Black Orcs, though, being more intelligent and generally more able and organised, managed to escape, even though I assume a lot of the slaves were killed or recaptured. Many of the Black Orcs escaped into the Mountains of Morn, where their descendants to remain to this day, while others undertook the long journey to the west and eventually reached the Old World. The Chaos Dwarfs still recruit Black Orcs to this day into their armies as mercenaries, which I'm assuming they deal with a lot better as they're paid than being just slaves doing grunt work in the pits where they eventually die from exposure. So I suppose everybody wins in the end. What is interesting, though, is why the hobgoblins would betray the other greenskins against the Chaos Dwarfs. And we can only assume that they realised they would probably be treated better by the Chaos Dwarfs after they betray their brethren and save them than they would be by the greenskins in a victorious army. And I think why this happened can be explained by this quote from an orc shaman.
Gork and Mork made the goblins for us to kick, kill and eat. They is nothing. They is less than nothing. Even their magic is weak and pointless. Only use they got in a fight is catching human arrows with their heads.
So I guess because the hobgoblins knew they would be grouped in with the goblins, defined under Gork and Mork made them for us to kick, kill and eat them, they didn't want that, as they're not even like normal goblins. They probably saw themselves as higher than normal goblins and thought they deserved more than that. And I guess they thought they'd get more by cashing in with the Chaos Dwarfs than they would with their own kind. So, these hobgoblins, which are like bigger goblins, are essentially slave drivers and mercenaries to the Chaos Dwarfs now, and have a higher status than the other slaves. So I suppose that worked for them. Although all greenskins hate them now and want to kill them. So they can't go back on this decision. There's no way that they're going to be able to go back on the decision now. Another point worth discussing is the fact that sorcerers are actually top dog in the kind of societal hierarchy of the Chaos Dwarfs. And every dwarf is assigned to a sorcerer as his kind of personal allegiance that they are fiercely loyal to. Most of the property is owned by various different sorcerers. The top dog, however, at the tippity top of the pyramid, is the oldest and most powerful sorcerer, on whom Hashut's blessings are bestowed, because age and knowledge are respected by them, just as much as by the dwarfs of the West, although sorcerers, even existing, even besides them being top dogs in the society, would be complete blasphemy to the dwarfs of the West, as they only respect their rune magic, which isn't proper magic. And as well as this respect of age and knowledge, the Chaos Dwarfs take in the reverse as well, which is disdain for weakness and lack of knowledge, which is kind of a natural progression from where the dwarves of the West are at, who are kind of on the verge of that anyway, really. It's quite easy to see how dwarfs could be evil. Favour and respect with them is only maintained through strength, wealth and sorcerous might, which makes the politics of the priesthood deadly at all turns. The price the sorcerer prophets and demon smiths pay for their position of power is a dark one indeed, for should they show weakness, they will fall, and Hashut's demand for blood upon the altar fires is unquenchable. Worse is the great curse that lays heavy on them, as the magic they work seeps into their bodies, evoking changes in them that are both unique and horrific. Even the most cautious and adept of them are not immune, although for the desperate or foolhardy, the curse comes on all the swifter, as inexorably their bodies are petrified into immobile stone, starting with their feet. At first their legs turn grey and solid so that they can't move, and their followers have to carry them around or else have them construct a mechanical engine to move them about. Then their lower body and torso turn to stone, making them extraordinarily tough. Once their arms become stone, they are entirely dependent on their followers to perform their magic, and all they can do is speak and watch their progress. After a while, their entire body turns to stone, and he becomes a statue. The statues of the Chaos Dwarf sorcerers are all lined up along the roadways around the tower of ZHARR NAGGRUND, forming rank upon rank of grey stones, watching over the approach to the city. Perhaps this is some kind of reaction of the dwarven body, which is kind of resistant to magic, against magic. The fact that they're doing this magic is never fully accepted by their dwarven biology, perhaps. Okay, something I would like to add about the kind of lore of the Chaos Dwarfs that I was reading was the fact that when we talk about how they became the Chaos Dwarfs and this god revealed itself to them, Hashut, the god in the shape of a bull, who's the god of fire and war and kind of anger and shit like that. The Lord of Shadows or something is what they call him. This is a typical Chaos God contract, which is when you're in a tough spot. Sometimes this Chaos God actually puts you in the tough spot, deliberately in order to make you agree to the contract, and once you're presented with the contract, when you accept, you get certain blessings, but when you accept, you're just under the thumb, and you're just like, it's game over for you, really. So, for an example of this, there is in Warhammer 40k, there's a series of books called the Horus Heresy, which outlines some of the backstory of the human empire in this universe, and it tells you how it came to be, basically. How it kind of fell from grace, really. And there's a Space Marine. I assume all of you are probably going to know what a Space Marine is, because the 40k is pretty famous compared to Warhammer Fantasy, especially Space Marines. I mean, they're kind of everywhere. There's a Space Marine who's on a sick bed, and he's been infected. Same Chaos Gods, by the way, in this universe, so Nurgle is in this universe. He's been infected by a really disgusting supernatural disease from Nurgle that keeps you on the edge of death, basically indefinitely. And he's on this sick bed, kind of semi-conscious in a kind of fever dream. And there's nothing they can do to make it better because it's a magical disease, like there's no real kind of germs to overcome. And while he's in this kind of feverish state, in a coma essentially, there's this little voice in his head that goes like,
I can make it all go away. Just submit to Grandfather Nurgle, and he will take it all away.
And of course, because he's a Space Marine, he resists for a long time, until eventually he gives in. And usually, when someone gives in, it's usually described as kind of revealing some inherent weakness that they have, some kind of jealousy or insecurity that they have, that the Chaos God feeds off of and picks them out as a weak target, mentally. Even if they're not, they could be like the best soldier, but they have this certain complex that makes them vulnerable. So anyway, when he agrees, he turns into a huge flippin' plague-bearer demon of Nurgle and goes around this medical bay and just starts killing Space Marines and brutally just ripping them apart and shit. So he just turns into a demon, full possession, and loses his mind completely and becomes a demon. So these almost never turn out to be in the interests of the person that actually makes the pact, but they come at a time when the person is usually desperate and it's presented as a way out. So this is one of the reasons why people think that the Lady of the Lake for the Bretonnians is actually a Chaos God, or a proxy of another Chaos God is really the argument, because they can be different aspects of a Chaos God. So she could be an aspect of Khorne that is feeding Khorne energy through worship. Because she presents herself to the Bretonnian knights at a time when they're about to be destroyed by a huge army of greenskins, and they submit to her, take her blessing, and then they beat the greenskins with this magical buff. So yeah, maybe. There's some kind of theory there. But anyway, this same contract theory can be applied to Hashut and the Chaos Dwarfs, because they were dying from this strange chaos problem that they had, and then Hashut saves them, and after Hashut saves them, they start getting all these mutations, and their behaviour becomes more and more evil with regard to the whole slave trading and sacrificing people and stuff like that. Hashut requires sacrifices, and I think it's quite plausible to say that Hashut is possibly a aspect of Khorne, because he looks similar and seems to make the Chaos Dwarfs more aggressive towards other races and provokes them to war. But yeah, perhaps there's arguments for other gods, but that seems to be the most obvious one to me. So there you go. Also, if you're into history, you should look up the Assyrians, the ancient Assyrian Empire, because the aesthetics of the Chaos Dwarves are very much just kind of grafted from the Assyrian Empire. And even just like the way they behave is kind of inspired by that, and these kind of like ziggurats that they build and perhaps even the fact that the sorcerers are at the top. I'm not sure about that. But the Assyrians were like this huge empire in the Middle East, in like Mesopotamia, and they made these massive like ziggurat kind of pyramid things, and they're famous for just being absolutely unbeatable in war for a very long time, making a huge empire and taking a lot of slaves and killing a lot of people by impaling them and stuff like that. Yes, but like interestingly, the Assyrians kind of, after dominating for so long, a huge coalition of different tribes from the area, like the Medes, the Babylonians, Lydians, Hittites, I'm not sure, but like loads of different cultures or countries banded together, kind of copied some of their military tactics, I think, and when their power was waning, they all kind of rose up and took them over. And then I think the next big power was the Persians, as in the Persians that the Greeks fought. So that's kind of puts it in context of what kind of time in history we're talking about. So, you know, the ancient Greeks are pretty far in the past. The Persians, the Persian dynasty that they fought against, Persians that 300 tries to depict, and that fought in the Battle of Marathon as well, that dynasty is the one that comes after the Assyrians. Alright, so now I'm going to talk about some of the more interesting units of the Chaos Dwarfs, starting with the Lamassu, which is some strange beast here that I find quite funny. The Lamassu has the body of a gigantic bull, a powerful mace-tipped tail, and a massive, ugly head. The Chaos Dwarfs believe that the Lamassu is a rare mutation of the Great Taurus, a creature whose forebears were once Chaos Dwarfs, but which has become twisted by the powers of chaos into a huge bull-shaped monster. So I guess the Great Taurus that it's talking about here is like the Chaos Dwarf equivalent of a Chaos Spawn, which is when a warrior of chaos has been blessed too much in too short a time period by the Chaos Gods, so they just kind of explode into mutating energy, and that creates the kind of just strange, fucked up biomass that a spawn is. Yeah, so I guess a Great Taurus is the Chaos Dwarf example of that. The Lamassu's ancestry is evident in its tusked head, its thickly curled beard, and its considerable intelligence. It is a creature with magical properties. It breathes not an ordinary air, but the power of magic itself, drawing into itself the power of the winds of magic. As it exhales, the creature breathes out swirling clouds of black sorcery, which wreathe themselves around the Lamassu, entrapping it with protective power by protecting it from hostile spells. The Lamassu is the favourite mount of the Chaos Dwarf sorcerers. Enemies fighting Lamassu in melee often find the smoky threads of sorcery befouling their magic weapons, dampening their power, and preventing them from striking the beast to full effect. Lamassu rarely seek to enter the battle themselves, at least not as a first resort. A Lamassu would rather convince other beasts to do the dirty work for it. In a stark contrast to its breathtakingly ugly appearance, the Lamassu possesses a peculiar and insidious charisma that it uses to further its own agendas. When reinforced by the Lamassu's magical artifice, this can leave the creature's victims befuddled and suggestible in the span of a few short minutes. Great Taurus, wyverns, pegasi, and griffins are all susceptible to the Lamassu's honeyed words and cunning manipulations. Only the most maddened and ferocious of monsters can withstand the Lamassu's voice, and then only out of red-fogged rage rather than any conscious resistance. Whilst the Great Taurus is undoubtedly the king of the plains of ZHARR, it only reigns because the Lamassu is content to let it. Chaos Dwarf sorcerers have used Lamassu as steeds for thousands of years, but who's to say whether it is the mount or the rider that commands the partnership? Yeah, like, as funny as I find this, which is mainly just because I imagine it kind of snuggling up to a griffin or a wyvern or something and just being like, hey, so I guess how are you doing? Like, why don't you do my bidding? And being really, like, charismatic. Just like a really charismatic voice coming out of its face is, like, a funny idea to me. But, yeah, this is still cool, though, because you don't often see monsters that are cool because of their intelligence, and when you do see monsters that are cool because of their intelligence, it's rarely because of their actual charisma that it kind of manifests itself as useful. So yeah, this is really interesting, and the idea of a Chaos Dwarf sorcerer riding this that is actually being controlled by it is really funny as well. But yeah, really cool kind of unique creation here. Another thing that this is similar to the Assyrians, by the way, is that the Assyrian gods looked very similar to this. They were all kind of like bulls and stuff with sometimes human heads. So yeah, that's another little nugget for you. Some other cool monsters that they have are the Kadai, which are called Fireborn, Man-Burners and Destroyers in terms of rank, from lowest to highest. And they're basically things that the sorcerer prophets forge out of metal and flame, and they essentially possess the metal and flame with demons, and then the demon kind of animates the metal and flame, and so they create a kind of molten metal demon, which is pretty cool. So they're kind of like lava beasts, and most of them are kind of humanoid with metal weapons and stuff, kind of rising out of the lava, and some of them, the destroyers, the higher ranking ones, form into the shape of bulls and other kind of stuff like that. As well as this, they have the siege giant, which is a giant that has been captured and tamed to the Chaos Dwarf cause, and they kind of bolt attachments onto the giants to make them more useful. So they kind of just rivet iron plates into its flesh and stuff like that to make it resistant to arrows, which is the main kind of weakness to arrows, at least in the Total War game. But yeah, and they kind of bolt weapons onto its arms and shit. It's a very Clan Squire kind of situation there, like how they make the rat ogres, and then they unleash the giant upon the enemy ranks. And another kind of Chaos Dwarf that we have are the Bull Centaurs, which are essentially a minority of the Chaos Dwarf births are so warped by chaos that they have hooves, and basically the bottom half of their body is that of a bull, which is considered a blessing of Hashut, because Hashut is in the shape of a bull, so it's like, whoa, these are amazing new children, and they give them immediately to sorcerers to serve. Now, these bull centaurs are one of the last lines of defense of the Chaos Dwarfs, as they are often employed as temple guardians for the majority of their time. As well as serving as temple guardians, the bull centaurs are also entrusted with dangerous tasks by their masters, who trust them implicitly. They are hulking, savage creatures whose strength and endurance far exceeds that of a Chaos Dwarf, and thanks to their strange forms, they are far swifter in battle. Clip-clop. As they age, their flesh hardens and distorts almost to the consistency of a living metal, and rather than heal naturally from injuries, they must instead rely upon their sorcerer masters to repair their wounds with poultices of molten mercury, steel structures and blazing splints. Although as keen-witted and intelligent as their Chaos Dwarf brethren, and utterly devoted to the worship of Hashut, their father of darkness, they are even swifter to anger, and are often otherwise preoccupied with a great hunger for flesh. A good number of the slave sacrifices bound for Hashut's temples will actually be rent apart, limb from limb, at the Bull Centaur's holy feasts, as while slave meat is a common fare for the Chaos Dwarfs, the Bull Centaurs prefer their meals both alive and screaming. The Chaos Dwarfs also have some of the best technology in the Warhammer world, including artillery. So for example, they have the Death Shrieker rocket launcher, which fires rockets imbued with tortured fire spirits that scream through the air as they go towards their targets, and these spirits come from sacrificed souls that are killed and pushed into the flames of Hashut. Additionally, we have the Hell Cannon, which is the only artillery unit of the Chaos Warriors faction in Warhammer Total War. That's a Chaos Dwarf invention as well, and as you can see in the game, it's manned by a team of black-bearded dwarves that I suppose are supposed to be Chaos Dwarfs. So this is actually loaded, which you can't see in the game. This isn't fully represented. I guess it would have kind of pushed the rating up to an 18. I'm not sure what it is at the minute, but it's loaded by shoveling the destroyed corpses of your enemies into this furnace that's at the back of it, and it eats away all of the flesh until only the souls of your enemies are left, and then it forms a kind of magical energy out of the souls and shoots that out. So that's why it's kind of screaming as it goes through the air. And funnily enough, the demons that are encased within this hell cannon are so lusty for blood that they have to chain the hell cannon down to the ground to stop it from rampaging towards the enemy lines, which is quite funny. They also have the Dreadquake Mortar, which is like a huge immobile mortar device which has to be loaded by an ogre with these huge metal spheres. There's essentially just like a massive artillery piece that does massive area damage, good for destroying buildings and cities. And they also have the Magma Launcher, which kind of is a close-range artillery piece that shoots out magma to burn tightly packed units of infantry. These things will be wheeled around by this evil Thomas the Tank Engine that the Chaos Dwarfs make, which is called a demon engine, and this wheels around the artillery so that they don't have to push it along, and also can be used in battle as there's kind of turrets and stuff mounted on it, and it can also, it's heavy enough to just roll over things, kind of like a steam tank of the Empire. And it runs on coal, but also other fuels can be used that are slightly less efficient, but workable if you run out of coal. And also it can run on slaves and living matter as well, because there are obviously demons inside it that lust for blood. So yeah, very versatile engine that's used to pull around the artillery pieces and then can also be used in a battle if it's needed. With the Chaos Dwarfs themselves providing the heavily armoured core of the army, with axes and close combat weapons, as well as sophisticated handguns and crossbows for ranged units. They also have a huge load of slaves and mercenaries that they'll take with them, such as the mercenary Black Orcs that we've already described. They can also have hobgoblins with them, which will usually just be kind of chaff units for melee. But hobgoblins also have a huge culture of being wolf riders, and hobgoblin wolf riders are prized for slave raiding expeditions because they can travel far and wide away from the main army to go to all the different villages and stuff, perhaps even before the main armies arrived, for scouting and things like this, to forage for food to keep the army alive, or just to pick up slaves along the way, or just to kind of spot targets. And obviously the dwarves themselves don't have the best mobility. Even the bull centaurs, if they have any bull centaurs with them, they won't be as fast as a goblin on a wolf. So yeah, very useful there. Okay, so that's about as much as I have time to cover, to be honest. If there's any more questions you can ask, I could answer them in a comment, or I could perhaps make another video if you have any suggestions for other videos to make. So yeah, thank you for that. I believe I did remake it. I definitely made it bigger. I believe I made it better as well, because there were some things that came up while I was redoing it, like the dwarf reproduction thing, that I didn't have in before. So I think it's, you know, all in all, I learnt a lesson, and Sir Ganja Killer, the community, with my disciples, moves onward, forging down the road, undaunted. So yeah, thank you. Cheers for watching, and leave any suggestions if you have them. Cheers.